I'm going to be talking to Dr. Mark Winfield, who's a professor of environmental studies at York University, about his recent op-ed in the Policy Options magazine. It's titled Federal Gifts for the Nuclear and Mining Industry. So welcome to the interview, Mark.
Hello, Markham. How are you doing?
Just great, thank you. Now, look, the centerpiece in your op-ed is this nuclear project in New Brunswick that was given, basically the federal government said it didn't qualify to be assessed under the larger federal environmental assessment process. Can you explain why the federal government made that decision?
Well, I think that's in the good question category. On the face of it, this would seem to be a very good case for review under the Impact Assessment Act, given that the technology going to be used at this small modular reactor at Point Lepreau in New Brunswick is essentially unknown. There are no operating examples, and we have no functional or economic data in relation to it. And indeed, there have been very serious questions being raised about this project, as it's intended to reprocess the fuel, the waste fuel from the Point Lepreau CANDU reactors. And indeed, up to the point, people who are very knowledgeable about matters nuclear have been even raising questions of weapons proliferation because of the nature of the products that would be coming out of and indeed violations of the Weapons Proliferation Treaty, to which Canada is a party, because of what it seems is likely to come out of this reactor as the final product. And so the question is, well, why in those circumstances would there not have been an impact assessment under the Impact Assessment Act?
Now, the federal government has said in its announcement that it believes that the Nuclear Safety Control Act, the federal act, and provincial legislation is adequate to cover all of the concerns that you raised. Do you buy that?
No, not at all. This is actually a major step backwards relative to the oversight that we would have seen on a major nuclear and virtually any nuclear project prior to the C-69 version of the federal impact assessment process. Previously, under the former Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, CNSC approval for a nuclear project was what is called a law list trigger. It was one of the federal approvals which automatically triggered a federal environmental assessment of a project. Now, those were usually conducted jointly with the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, but it was a very, very different process in the sense of the level of oversight and review being given to the project. So relative to what would have been in the past and what has been in the past, where we have seen federal impact assessments as part of the review of these types of projects, certainly last time we had any major nuclear projects in Canada, this is a major step backwards relative to that standard of review.
This reminds me of comments that Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland made about other energy projects, specifically LNG and hydrogen, where she talked about fast-tracking regulatory approval. And I wonder if the government isn't so anxious to get other sources of energy, but primarily low emissions energy, that it maybe is bending the rules a little bit.
Well, it's bending them quite a bit, depending on your reference point. Indeed, there was a briefing with the Impact Assessment Agency the other day where they pretty much said that anything that falls into this category of clean energy is not going to be subject to individual project review under the Impact Assessment Act. And again, this is very, very different from what would have happened under the former CIA, the Federal Assessment Act, where most of those projects almost certainly would have triggered one form or another, one way or another, a formal federal review, impact assessment review, and particularly concerning in the sense that you might be able to make a case for that at an individual project level if you had then conducted the review at a more strategic level, that we've done a review of hydrogen, or we've done a review of small modular reactors generally, and then have concluded that, well, no, there's not a huge amount of concern here, although I find that unlikely if you did that. But if you did, you could make a case that, yes, we've looked at this at a conceptual level and a broad level, and therefore we don't need to look at it in much depth at an individual project level. That has not happened. Quite emphatically, there seems to be an express train kind of moving forward on some of these things, and there is not much review happening.
Now, I have to point out the irony here, Mark, because the Bill C-69, which was highly contentious, the oil and gas industry opposed it. They called it the Anti-Pipeline Act and so on. And the argument was made during, while it was being deliberated, was that no large-scale energy projects and no energy infrastructure would ever be built again in this, because the process, the review process would just be too onerous. And here we have, it almost seems like that concern is being turned on its head, and now the process is now less onerous than it was prior to C-69 and this act.
Oh, it is unquestionably, and this was raised at the time. I was actually on one of the advisory committees on C-69. That this concern was out there about triggering. I mean, there are many of us who study environmental assessment who never really bought the argument that SIA had been a fundamental barrier. I mean, things were built, including Trans Mountain, under the SIA framework. So we're never entirely bought that argument. But no, there's an irony here that we've actually ended up with a I could argue dangerously weakened regime. For all the hate that was thrown at C-69, I'm not sure that the people doing that fully grasped how much weaker C-69 is, which is essentially a derivative of C-38, which is Stephen Harper's version of the act, relative to what existed prior to Bill C-38 in 2012. So yes, there is undoubtedly an irony here that there's complaints about legislation which is actually substantially weaker in many ways than what existed before in terms of the federal environmental assessment process.
Now, one of the points that you make in this op-ed that I found was interesting was that there really doesn't seem to be any larger framework for evaluating clean energy choices going forward, given that, there's so many of them. I mean, there's wind and there's solar and there's storage and there's, nuclear and geothermal is coming down, and tidal will be coming along. And it seems to be that we're so desperate to advance decarbonization that it's every tool in the toolbox, and whatever tool is to hand, that's what we're going to grab. And in this case, it happened to be a small modular reactor.
Yeah, I think that's it. It has the danger here is the crisis doesn't mean we give up our capacity for critical thought, and I think there's a danger here that this is I argue in the article, and there's a larger piece behind the article, which essentially argues what seems to be going on is a bit of a lobbying feeding frenzy at this stage. And it's one that's being dominated by well-established actors, mining, nuclear, fossil fuels, and particularly when you follow where most of the money is going from the federal government, it is quite striking how much is being poured into critical minerals, small modular reactors, with very, very little thought. It seems to, is this really going to make that much of a contribution in terms of meeting our decarbonization targets? Does this really make sense? And also, are there risks and impacts here? And this is particularly acute with the SMR question. Are there risks and impacts here that we maybe need to think about a lot more carefully before we go charging down this pathway? And that just doesn't seem to be happening. And that to me is very concerning, because we need to move forward on decarbonization. And as identified in the article, there's lots of elements of the federal strategy which don't raise particularly large questions. They're more issues of program design and are you doing this efficiently and effectively, as opposed to is this really where you should be going? But there doesn't seem to be any filter that's apparent in terms of where there are places where we should be saying, just wait a minute. Let's ask a few more questions about where this is going and where this takes us before we shovel billions of dollars of taxpayers' money at it. And I do mean quite literally billions. And we essentially say, well, we don't need to look at it in any great depth. We're just going to go ahead.
Wrap up this conversation, Mark. I have been told on a number of occasions that when the federal government, announces a project or announces programs such as, funding and subsidies for clean energy in this case, but it could be in other areas as well. But it's like once that announcement is made, it's anything with that is shovel ready. Any project that's sitting on the shelf that can be pulled off the shelf and started right away, that a minister can get out in front of and grab a shovel and pose for a photo op, they get approved. And there's very little of the kind of thought and consideration that you're talking about put into it. It's just a rush to get projects out the door and funded. And kind of sounds like maybe this is part of the issue here.
Well, I think that's part of what's going on for sure, is that, yes, there is, there is a commendable desire to move forward on decarbonization. And in many ways, the strategies the federal government has articulated are vastly more comprehensive than anything we've seen previously. And I think one has to acknowledge that. But elements of these strategies do raise very, very significant questions, both about their effectiveness, but also their impacts and risks. And there doesn't seem to be a filter going on either at the level of sort of the a strategic level in terms of the technological pathways, and certainly not. Indeed, this conversation about LaCroix emphasizes it, certainly not at the level of the individual projects. And it would seem you need to do that stop and think at one of those levels. I mean, what I've done in the article is essentially a kind of triage level review of elements of the strategy. You said, well, there's some of these things we need to be thinking about a little bit more. And that does not seem to be happening. It seems to be that if you can get in there and promise something, we're going to shovel you a pile of money and we're not going to ask any questions. Seems to be where we're at.
And one final point, and that is you and I have had discussions in other interviews about the danger of allowing incumbents to dominate these kinds of processes, whether that is electrical utilities, whether that are big oil and gas companies, whether that's big mining companies. The incumbents always have the leg up because they know the processes, they have the resources, they have legions of lobbyists to influence ministers and bureaucrats. And this just the SMR and other projects like it just screams dominated by incumbents.
It is a triumph of the incumbents is what we seem to be seeing, for the reason you say, and especially in very streamlined decision-making processes, all the factors you've just identified in terms of capacity, connections, institutional embeddedness, tends to mean that they tend to win in that kind of a situation. They've got the access and they've got the resources to put the proposals on the table, and they're going to be able to sing a tune that matches what the government wants to hear, and that seems to be part of what's going on here. To say the government's overall commitment on decarbonization is highly commendable, and one wants to emphasize that. But there are places in this process where a bit more critical thinking really needs to be happening.
Well, on that note, Mark, thank you very much for this. Always appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Good talking to you.